everybody, today I am driving a car that I've no idea whether I should love or hate. I suppose then the only sensible thing to do is find out. This is a 2016 Audi RS Q3, and I want to say a big thank you to its owner Lee for bringing it out last minute. You see, due to an administrative error, in other words, I'm an idiot, I found myself with a glorious sunny weekend and no cars to film. So, a hasty community post on YouTube, and several people very kindly offered their cars and their time. This is the first of two that I chose, and I think it's a rather quirky thing. I said that I wasn't sure whether this is a car that I should love or hate. Let's begin with a few of the reasons that I might hate it. First off, it's a Q3. It's that weird, small, crossover kind of car that is sort of tall and tries to look big, but actually isn't. The Q3, as it happens, is particularly small. This car is less than 4.4 meters in length, making it even shorter than the BMW X1. Larger SUVs I tend to forgive, stuff like the full-fat Range Rover, or in Audi terms the Q7, because they are capable off-road. They do have lots of room. They do somewhat justify the amount of space they take up. But stuff like this doesn't really seem to bring all that much to the party. Despite it being larger than the A3, with which it shares many components, this car has no more room inside or in the boot. All that's actually happened is they've knackered the styling and the centre of gravity. This is a slightly later Q3, so it's received a facelift, and being the RS, it has a few touches that do make it stand out. I have recently spent a little bit of time with a garden variety Q3 diesel, a slightly earlier car, and in fairness to the RS, there are a number of changes that do make it stand out, provided you've parked it next to a regular Q3. The fact is, if this car were in a car park more or less anywhere, I'd probably walk past it. For some, that will be a negative. For others, a positive. Lee has even gone to the trouble of debadging the car. He's taken the RS logos off the front and the rear. So the only clues remaining that hint at what this is are the large wavy discs at the front with the RS branded calipers and the oval exhaust at the back. There's only one of those as well, and that's really quite surprising. You would have thought something with this amount of power would fully justify a pair of pipes, but apparently no. This then brings us on to a reason why you would love this car. You see, at the front, with a slightly spicy hot hatch or crossover type thing, you would fully expect a 2-litre turbo 4. And in most cases, you'd be right, but not here. Up front, you will find the 2.5-litre 5-cylinder turbo, as seen in things like the TT-RS and RS3. In early versions of the car, this made 310 horsepower. In this, it's 340, and for the later RS Q3 Performance, it made about 370. What does that do then? Let's find out. It gives it some serious poke. I have to say, this thing moves. It's a characterful engine, makes a great sound, pulls very hard, although in this guise, in other words, standard, it's actually a bit more muted than I would have hoped for. This car is pre-particulate filter, so this was when we could make exhausts more or less as loud as we wanted, and yet Audi seemed to have displayed it a little bit too safe for my liking. Turbo lag is present, but not problematic. However, what is the handling. I have rarely encountered such an oddly set up car. I know Audis get a reputation for having very little feel in the steering, but this is quite extreme. There is absolutely nothing coming through this rack at all, and it's this weird sort of blend between too light then too heavy without really doing anything helpful. I put the car into its sporty drive mode. You have dynamic, comfort and auto, and that's your only choices. All those are really altering are the profile of the gearbox, which also has a sport mode anyway, the weight of the steering and probably the throttle as well. The suspension on this car is passive. It was only with the later Q3 Performance that you got the option of adaptive dampers. I'm going to actually set the car into comfort mode and see if it improves the steering. Oh yes, I believe it has actually. Turning circle is okay, not stellar, but acceptable. Interior space, by the way, is actually okay. You can get 4 adults in here reasonably comfortably, but any more than that might be a bit of a struggle. Yeah, comfort mode is actually the better one because the steering has no more feel or feedback in it, but it is at least lighter. The suspension is actually a very odd setup too. You would expect this being an RS model to be a little bit firm, hunkered down, really grip the road, perhaps at the expense of overall ride quality. But the truth is, it's actually really quite composed. This is a problem though, because this composure, that means it's a very comfortable car across even fairly bad surfaces, means that you don't get much in the way of feel through the wheel or the chassis. That means you really don't know if you can trust it, because what you do know about the car is that, like many in Audi, it is going to be fairly front biased. There is a relatively large engine and gearbox up the front. It's a Haldex all-wheel drive system, meaning that by default it's front-wheel drive, only becoming all-wheel drive when necessary. And this doesn't give you the most confidence to really push on. In fact, the one change Lee has made to the car's specification is the brake pads. He's fitted some EBC red stuff up the front because he felt like the standard items just weren't up to the task. Let's enjoy a little bit more of that poke though. The brakes do certainly work, although you get a very good sense of this car's mass. If you're interested, the car weighs apparently about 1,650 kilos. The 0 to 60 time of this is just under 5 seconds, around 4.8 versus the 4.4 of the regular RS3. Top speed limited to 155. Other boring stuff you may want to know: fuel economy on a run is surprisingly good. About 36 can be achieved if you're willing to cruise at 65 rather than 70. As an overall average for the last several thousand miles, this car has achieved 23 to the gallon. Far less impressive and some way short of the 32 mpg claimed for the car, but I think for something that is enjoyed, as its owner says, that's not horrendous. An E46 M3 would probably do about the same. The interior of the car is admittedly very Audi, but compared with the base model, it does have a few little touches that make it feel just a little nicer. So you've got extra pieces of leather everywhere. The leather seats certainly help. I actually quite like them. They're fairly comfortable, if not the most supportive, but in this car, that's not a problem. The steering wheel is very nice in the hand, thin-rimmed, which is what I like. It has just the right amount of controls. The paddles here do their job well enough. They don't impress in an R8, but in an RS Q3, they're fine. Fun fact, the RS Q3 was the first of Audi's SUVs to actually receive the RS treatment. I believe to date, the only other one is the RS Q8. Around town, the car is quite quiet. Contemporary reviews did criticise the suspension quite a bit, and when you are at lower speeds, I'm doing 20 mile an hour right about now, it is just a little jittery, but nothing for me really to write home about. If anything, I'd say Audi could really have afforded to stiffen the suspension up. I can very easily see why road testers were not particularly taken with this car. The steering is genuinely atrocious. The gearbox works well enough, but is nothing really to write home about. The engine is certainly the star of the show, but you can get it in other, much more capable cars, which have just as much room in them, probably cost a similar amount when new, and deliver similar MPG figures. The RS Q3 then was left as a sort of weird kind of mishmash hybrid for the sort of customer that wasn't sensible enough to want an RS3, but wasn't then brave enough to get a sort of full-size powerful SUV, or didn't have the budget for something like a Range Rover, which would have been more than double the amount that this was when new. Today, if you want to pick one of these up used, you'd be looking at parting with around £20,000 for the earliest examples. Why then should you? Well, though it is a very, very flawed car, there is one way you can think about this where it'll make sense. This is going to sound a little bit bold here, but to enjoy this car, you have to be Walter Röhrl. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't need to be actual Walter Röhrl, although it would very much help if you were. However, that's a rather small target demographic. No, to enjoy this car fully, you've got to apply a little bit of imagination. You have to pretend like you're not in a regular Audi family car. The fact it's got not entirely terrible suspension when pushing on, but rather light steering combined with a heck of a lot of power does give me the sensation of driving something like, and I know this will sound nuts, a bowler. You know, the big Land Rover Defender based things, the proper Paris-Dakar cars. That's the way you imagine you're driving one of these, and then the precision of it, the absolute pinpoint accuracy you'd expect from a proper hot hatch, no longer becomes something you're missing, because you don't actually get much of it in those cars either. They're all about big speed, big power, being quite bold, being able to see a little bit further. And although I'm not going to make any attempt to say this is just like one of those, if you pretend it's just like one of those, I think you can have a lot of fun. And it's rare that I would actually recommend this, but I think you could enjoy this even more if you modify it just a little bit. You want to pep that engine up a little bit. It's well known you can get more power out of it quite easily. As for the suspension, I'm not entirely sure what you'd do. I'd probably put some stickier rubber on here. The steering feel, I think, is probably a lost cause. A slightly fruitier exhaust, I don't think, is really going to harm anyone. You can definitely unleash a little bit more volume without ruining everybody's day. I would then use this as the kind of car that if you fancy, you can simply take to the shops and back. Or, if you want to go and watch the rally whenever it reappears, you can sticker the car up, have a bit of a laugh, go down with some mates and really enjoy yourself. No, the Quattro system here is not going to be as robust as in some other cars, but it'll probably do enough of a job. The fact that this car, in its current guise, can fly almost completely under the radar, I think is also going to be a boon for most of the people who are considering it. Would this then be a car that I could recommend to many people? Probably not. But would it be a car I blamed anyone for buying? Also, no. The interior layout I think is nice and logical. I like the fact that there are proper physical controls for pretty much everything you want to access. There is a little screen up here which unfortunately is manually operated and just feels a bit cheap and nasty, but it does the job, and this later car has a more modern system in it, so it does look a little bit flasher, has nicer graphics, higher res, all that sort of stuff. Happily, I can also tell you that in the 4 years and 35,000 miles Lee has had this car, it has been almost entirely reliable. The only issue he had was with one of the coil packs, and he will confess that probably was self-inflicted because he did some cleaning in the engine bay and we think some water got into one of them and that's why it failed. Other than that, the car has been genuinely faultless. That's enough from me then. Don't forget to hit the like button down below, subscribe if you haven't already, please do leave a comment, and I shall see you all for the next one. Bye bye.